Ahoy! For the first time ever, we'll be able to craft gear from PvP. Along with that, there are also various new ways to get different new gear sets, both from the PvP track as well as the faction shop, but also from open world PvP. This is quite a lot to navigate through, so I figured I'm gonna make a video summary showing you all the different options. I've timestamped them all as well, if you want to check out a specific one. And we begin with the faction shop, which some of you may have already seen. On the lowest tier we have some Gathering Edition, get Marauder Gathering Tools or whatever your faction is, as well as these Mastery rewards. So basically you can trade a relatively high amount of tokens, especially if you go further down the road, a small amount of gold for specific gathering XP, so for example logging here. These are not quite scaled properly yet. You will see that some of them cost more in comparison to how much XP they give, so it's still a PTR thing, but definitely something that's interesting. So on the Gladiator tier we can see the next version here, which provides you with a lot more XP and is slightly more expensive. It continues on the Ravager tier, once again, via the higher rarity, so more XP once again. In the Destroyer tier we don't have any of those XP additions, but we have the Banner Fragment, which we'll get back to in a second. You can keep this price in mind, but it's not gonna matter most of the time, I think. Another tier that got by far the highest overhaul is the Commander tier. The first thing that you can see here is that all the gear is 580 gear score now. This also includes the armor, and along with the armor it also includes the typical branded armor, I would say, the Legados in case of the Marauders, and every other faction has their own special armor. This now has the same perks as the normal armor, so it has Refreshing and Resilient, and is also at 580 now. Furthermore, you can also get this replica set for your faction, which seems to be a skin set. I think this may be the first time that you can just buy a skin in-game for gold and tokens without being tied to an event. Normally skins are purchasable from specific events. So quite interesting. Fairly steep pricing here, but on the other hand this means you don't have to use transmog tokens if you want to have the classic faction look. One row above that we also have the Shard of Pride. Again, we get to that in a second. It's related to the Banner Fragment. Furthermore, we have the 3 ultimate trophies. I've already talked about the price and everything, so we're not going to do that here, but they're in the faction shop as well. And last but not least, we have the Gathering Grand Caches, which are the highest XP you can get. Again, weirdly scaled, some of them, but this is as much as you would have to pay, really like 8,000 faction tokens, as well as 300 gold. Really not too expensive. You get quite a fair bit of XP if you're looking to level through PvP essentially and never actually want to do the gathering skill. This is especially a nice boost to get through the early levels. And that takes us over to the Forge, where we can find PvP replicas. And as you can see here, for the weapons you need 10 Banner Fragments and 1 Shard of Pride. For the armor pieces, the pricing is a little less steep, because you only need 10 Banner Fragments and no Shards of Pride. Now, this is something you can technically buy from the faction shop, but I don't think that's how you intended to get these. I'd like to thank Mr. Lou for helping me test this on PTR. We waited quite a while and killed each other a few times in open world PvP, and that does in fact sometimes drop the Banner Fragment, and is intended to drop the Shard of Pride as well according to New World Database. So buying these from the faction shop is really a last resort, and they will essentially function more like the specific expedition replicas. This goes in line with them also not being bind on pickup, so you can sell them as well, so that we trade it on the trading post for sure. Which is going to be very interesting, because you can essentially farm mats for others to craft PvP gear and make your money by PvPing. Obviously that works a lot better when there is enough open world PvP to do so, but we'll see about that in the near future. I will talk about that in a separate video. If you want to see that video, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. But the question is, if you look at the mats, why would you want to craft these when you can just craft normal gear or recalcum gear instead, without requiring these extra resources? In order to understand that, both for the weapons and the armor, we need to look into some more details about what they actually roll. So if we for example look at the Great Axe on nwdb.info, then we can scroll down to the perk bucket. We have a higher chance to roll Soldier. This is normal for the Great Axe, and the perks is what really interests us. And what you'll notice here is that there is a slight difference in chances, if you're familiar with the chances, from normal crafted or recalcum weapons. And that is due to certain perks not being on these weapons. More specifically, these perks are PvE perks. What you will not find here are perks like Bane, Kind, hated, and also for some reason no mortal perks. I am wondering if no mortal perks being on these weapons means that maybe they are planning to remove mortal perks with the expansion, so they are just not putting them on these weapons anymore in the first place. But I'm not sure about that, especially because there are some other new pieces of gear that actually do have mortal perks, so can't quite explain that one. But generally speaking, this means the rolls are at least a tiny bit better in terms of what you can actually get, because you can just not get the combinations of perks that you really don't care for, that just don't make any sense for PvP at all. What's interesting is that even if you want to roll PvE gear, these may be better than rolling normal Orichalcum if you are looking to not get, well, kind, hated, or mortal, which I think are usually pretty bad perks that you don't want. The chance to get a slightly more useful perk will still be slightly higher here. And Bane you can simply lock on the weapon with the craft mod then. Of course, that doesn't mean that all of the perks are great. You still have perks like Ruinous in there, and there's still perks that very few people use in very few situations, like Thwarting Counter, but at least better than the default. And on the Brutish armor, we have the exact same situation. You have a slightly higher chance to roll things like Resilient, you have no ward on here, you have no Indestructible, there are no resistance effects like Corruption Resistance, and there's also none of the different reinforced Gathering luck perks, so it's basically weapon perks throughout for the most part, which in my opinion is once again a lot better. Even if you're rolling PvE gear, you don't really want most of those other perks either, so you would just roll on ward with ward locked and then roll for the rest of it. Obviously not a massive improvement, and with the expansion on the horizon, I think people won't care that much to craft much with this right now, but I'm sure these will still be available after the expansion and can be used to craft gear there as well. By the way, open world PvP kills are also a lot more consistent in terms of rewards now, providing 800 PvP XP and Azoth Salt by default if the player has been active in PvP for 10 minutes. So that scaling system from 100 to 1600 no longer exists. We've tested this, as you can see here, there's a little extra scaling, but yeah, it is very much more consistent, and in my opinion this makes open world PvP a fair bit more rewarding. There are also new drops from the open world PvP kills. This is once again the Brutish gear, this time not the crafted replica. The problem is these are currently not really worth discussing because they drop at 500 to 510 gear score. They seem to not scale with expertise yet. I'm hoping this will be fixed and they'll scale with expertise, because they can technically drop at up to 600 gear score. It just wouldn't work under the way that they're currently set up, because the perks on them are once again the same as on the replica gear, so no PvE perks in here. You can actually technically get something good from here as long as they can roll at 600. Next we have the prestige sets, which are part of the new PvP track. You can see one of them right here. This one is a random roll, got Resilient, Fizz Aversion and Refreshing Ward on a medium piece of boots. Not the best, not the worst, basically. But I'm showing you this to prove that these are still in the game, which will be important a little bit later because there's also another set. The Prestige set comes with Resilient locked, which is absolutely fantastic. So everything you get from the PvP track will have at least Resilient. It can only roll single attributes, different chances for different ones. So for example, on the medium boots, you have a higher chance to roll con and dex in comparison. Because Resilient is not in the craft pool here, things look very interesting. We have Refreshing as the most likely perk, tied with Refreshing Ward, Refreshing Evasion, Freedom, Vigor, Invigorated, Shirking Fortification, Fizz Aversion, Elemental Aversion, so a lot of good ones here. Shirking Heals is also in there, but keep in mind that Shirking Heals is armor health, so you can get Resilient plus Shirking Fortification plus Shirking Heals, or Resilient plus Elemental Aversion plus Shirking Heals, so this can be useful for some if you like that playstyle. Outside of that, we of course have a long list of ability perks once again, but we are fortunately missing a lot of the less useful perks, because we don't have all the PvE stuff that we didn't have on the other armor either. So overall, these pieces should be fairly good. But there are more rewards that the new Ultimate had posted about that weren't really linked to things in-game yet. So we get the Predator weapons as well, and we get the new armor sets, which are all from the PvP track too. The Predator weapons all come with Vicious locked. This is not that great for some weapons like Blunderbuss and Greatsword, but actually fairly good for most weapons. Some weapons make better use of it than others because they can just fully break through the resilient cap, like for example the Great Axe, but even those that only do it under specific conditions, like Spear for example, can reasonably make use of it if you have the right attribute spent. The only outliers here are the shield that we'll look at in a second, the round shield, as well as the kite shield which comes with ref move, no one's really going to care about that I think, and the tower shield that comes with sure footing, which is definitely not going to be good. The perk buckets are quite interesting to look at as well. So we have a very high chance for Keen, but then for example in case of the Great Axe we have a very high chance for Insatiable Grafwell and a pretty high chance for Enfeebling Maelstrom and Crippling Reap. It looks like they generally try to prioritize perks that they consider useful in PvP. What they unfortunately didn't really consider, or maybe did on purpose to be honest, is that some of these perks are not necessarily what you want on your weapon. Like Insatiable Grafwell is something that you usually want to have on your armor and not on your weapon. But then for a newer player, having Insatiable Grafwell in the first place still massively helps them out, so I guess there's pros and cons to this, but either way, that can roll quite highly. But what can also roll here are PvP specific perks like Exhausted Exploitation and Purifying Crits, personally not the biggest fan of them, but more importantly, attunements. You can see all of the attunements here rolling with a 4% chance each, which makes that alone a 16% chance. But then you have to keep in mind that you have 2 chances to roll attunement because you have 2 perk buckets that both contain attunement now, so you have a pretty reasonable chance overall to get attunement on that weapon. The rest of the perk pool, once again, free of any PvE perks, so generally these should be fairly good to get you geared up for at least a beginner level, and if you're lucky you can even get a best in slot roll or something close to it, depending on if your weapon utilizes Vicious well or not. Just to show you some other perks, they are a bit all over the place with the chances, so for example the Sword has a 16% chance to get Contagious Reverse Stab, but a 3.3% chance for Empowering Leaping Strike, whereas on the Spear, all of the abilities actually have a very low chance, so maybe not quite finished yet, maybe they don't want them to be even in that regard, not quite sure what's going on, but one that I wanted to show you is the Shield. So this round shield comes with Keenly Empowered Locked, which is already a pretty good start for a round shield. Along with that, it has a very nice small perk pool. You have Vicious, Keen, Enchanted, and the ability perks. Compare that to the perk pool of the Orichalcum round shield and how much useless fluff is on there, so you know how good these shields are gonna be. The vast majority of them is gonna be either best in slot or very near best in slot if you pair them with a weapon that corresponds with the damage type here. But as I've already shown you, there is a second prestige reward as well, which is the Grand sets. So we have the Grand Overseer set. I'm just gonna quickly show you what the icons here look like for that. And then we move over to the medium one, because that, in my opinion, kind of takes the cake in terms of design here. I have this whole skull and bone set, including some bone gloves as well. And we can take a look at the perk pool here, of course. Again, locked single attribute. And otherwise we're seeing a familiar picture here in terms of perk availability. We once again have no PvE fluff in here at all. But this time we have different chances. We have a very high chance for freedom, very high chance for shirking fortification, and a reasonably high chance still for mental aversion. Interesting enough, if we go back to the light armor for 1 second, then you can see that the chances here are pretty much the same. And shirking fortification is also very high up, which I don't think many light armor users prefer at the moment. But if we move to the heavy version, then you can see that up the top we have freedom and refreshing ward as well as refreshing and elemental aversion very high, with shirking fortification being significantly lower. So especially for heavy, there are some pretty good chances to get a pretty good gear here. But if you are okay with using some shirking fortification, then even medium is most certainly an option. So overall, there are some pretty good chances to get pretty good gear here depending on what exactly you're after, but the competition between elemental aversion and shirking fortification is the high-end min-maxing. If you get either of those at this point and you don't have ideal gear yet, then you're gonna be happy to take it. What is a bit weird is that these armors don't contain all weapon perks. So for example, if you look at bow perks, the only perk that is available here is Enfeebling Poison Shot, and the others are not on this armor. I'm not entirely sure what the idea here is, but they have a very limited perk pool. This makes it much easier to actually get the wanted perks if they're not weapon specific, everything up here basically. But if you want a specific weapon perk, then these don't seem to be your best bet because some are simply not available on them. This is not a weight class thing either. You can say the same thing here on medium, for example, and the same thing here on light, so it is true for all of them. All in all, we have new craftable PvP gear, we have a new farmable PvP gear from open world, and we have various sets of PvP gear from the PvP track, so there's a lot more chances to actually get the stuff that you want. I think this is especially going to be interesting if you can farm most of that in open world and casually get PvP track on the side while doing so. So I will talk more about what I think about the upcoming open world changes through territory control in the next days and what I expect from that and what I'm hoping for. If you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. If you're interested in early trading tips, consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks to my patrons who do exactly that, and thank you for watching. SLOTH, out.